Picture a concert ticket. Face value $80. You go online the morning it drops, refresh the page at exactly 10 a.m., and by the time the page loads, it's sold out, gone in 90 seconds. A few hours later, you find the same ticket, same seat, same show, listed for $400 on a resale site. Nothing about that ticket changed. It's the same physical seat, the same 3 hours of music, but somewhere between the official sale and that resale listing, the price multiplied by 5, and millions of people, completely law-abidingly, pay it anyway. That's a black market, or at least a close cousin of one hiding in plain sight, wearing a completely legal outfit. And once you start looking for this pattern, you realize it's everywhere. Not just in the places we're taught to think of as shady or dangerous. It's in ticket resale, in currency exchange in certain countries, in unlicensed contractors, in counterfeit handbags, in the guy at the flea market who definitely didn't pay import duty on those electronics. Different scale, different legality, same underlying engine. I want to talk about that engine today, because black markets aren't really about crime. They're about what happens with almost mathematical predictability whenever an official price or an official rule stops matching what people are actually willing to pay or willing to do to get it. Whenever that gap opens up, a black market doesn't just become likely, it becomes almost inevitable, because the gap itself is an unclaimed profit sitting in plain sight, and someone, somewhere, is going to notice it. This is worth sitting with because it reframes the whole topic away from morality and toward mechanics. A black market isn't a sign that people are bad, it's a sign that an official system has created a gap that reality is rushing in to fill. Let's actually walk through how that gap gets created, because there are really just a couple of core mechanisms, and once you can spot them, you'll see them behind almost every black market you've ever heard of. The first mechanism is the price ceiling. This happens when a government or authority sets a maximum legal price for something, usually with good intentions, often to protect people from being priced out of something essential. Rent control is a classic example, and so is price capping on essentials during a crisis, like fuel or food during wartime or a natural disaster. The problem is that a price ceiling doesn't change how much people actually want the thing. It just makes the official price lower than what the market would otherwise settle at. And when the price is held artificially low, demand stays high, while the incentive to supply more of it shrinks because sellers can't charge what it would actually take to make expanding supply worthwhile. The result is a shortage. And shortages don't make demand disappear, they just push it underground, where a black market price, often far higher than the free market price would have been in the first place, quietly takes over. The second mechanism is prohibition, which works almost the opposite way but lands in the same place. Instead of capping the legal price, prohibition sets the legal price at essentially infinite by making the thing illegal to sell at all. But once again, banning something doesn't erase the demand for it, it just removes the legal supply, which means any supply that does exist commands an enormous premium, because now it has to compensate for real risk on top of production cost. We've talked before about how that risk premium works. The same logic applies whether we're talking about drugs, alcohol during a historical prohibition era, certain currencies under strict capital controls, or something as mundane as a specific version of a video game that got pulled from digital storefronts and now trades for absurd prices among collectors. And then there's a third, quieter mechanism that doesn't get talked about as much: information or access restriction. Sometimes nothing is technically banned or price capped, it's just artificially scarce, gated behind a process most people can't easily navigate: a visa system, a licensing requirement, a foreign exchange rule that only officially permits a tiny amount of currency conversion per year. Wherever there's a legitimate process that's slow, restrictive, or genuinely hard to access, a faster, informal alternative tends to appear right alongside it, charging a premium for convenience and access rather than for the underlying good itself. Now, here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because black markets don't just spring up and stay static. They develop their own internal logic, almost like a shadow version of a formal economy, complete with pricing signals, reputation systems, and even a kind of self-regulation. Take currency black markets, which exist in a number of countries with strict capital controls, where the government sets an official exchange rate that doesn't reflect what the currency is actually worth in practice. An unofficial exchange rate develops almost immediately, often openly discussed, sometimes even published in local news as a point of reference, because it's simply more accurate to real conditions than the official number. People operating in that unofficial market develop reputations, informal trust networks, and consistent pricing, not because anyone's enforcing honesty from above, but because a black market that's chaotic and untrustworthy doesn't generate repeat business, and repeat business is where the real money is. This is genuinely one of the more counterintuitive things about black markets. Many of them are, in their own way, remarkably orderly, not because participants are especially virtuous, but because disorder is bad for business in an underground market just as it is in a legal one. Arguably more so, since there's no court system to fall back on when something goes wrong. Reputation has to do all the work that contracts and legal enforcement do everywhere else. There's also a psychological piece worth naming honestly. The moral flexibility most of us apply, often without noticing, to different black or gray market behaviors, depending on how they're framed. Buying a counterfeit handbag at a steep discount can feel almost harmless to people who would never consider buying something they knew was stolen. Paying an unlicensed contractor in cash to skip the paperwork and save money feels different than participating in something explicitly labeled as an underground market, even though economically it's doing exactly the same thing, buying supply that exists specifically because it's operating outside an official system. We're remarkably good at drawing moral lines that don't actually track with the economics underneath them. Here's the turning point, and it's the piece that I think matters most. Black markets aren't a separate category from the regular economy. They're what the regular economy does whenever an official system creates a gap between what's allowed and what people actually want, need, or are willing to pay for. And that reframe changes how you look at rules and restrictions generally, not just criminal ones. Anytime you see a policy, a price cap, a quota, or access restriction, it's worth asking a quiet follow-up question. What happens to the demand this doesn't satisfy? Because that demand rarely just evaporates, it goes somewhere, and it's usually not somewhere better regulated or safer than where it started. This isn't a statement about whether any particular price cap, prohibition, or restriction is good policy or bad policy. Reasonable people genuinely disagree about that for good reasons in different situations, and the trade-offs are often real and complicated. But understanding the mechanism helps you see clearly that restrictions come with a kind of hidden cost that doesn't show up in the policy itself, the shadow market it tends to generate, and everything that shadow market brings with it, from safety risks to enforcement costs to the strange moral flexibility we all seem to apply once something is officially unofficial. So what's actually useful here in an ordinary life that mostly doesn't involve black markets in any dramatic sense? The most direct thing is simply recognizing when you're participating in one, even in a small, low-stakes way, because that recognition changes the questions worth asking. It often comes with real practical risk, since counterfeit goods, especially electronics, cosmetics, and medications, frequently skip the safety testing and quality control that makes the legitimate version reliable in the first place. The price gap you're taking advantage of is often the same gap where the safety corners got cut. It's also worth understanding why prices spike so dramatically during genuine shortages, whether that's a natural disaster, a supply chain disruption, or a sudden surge in demand for something specific. Some of that spike is opportunistic, and some of it is simply the black market mechanism working exactly as economics would predict. When official supply can't meet demand, Price becomes the thing that rations access instead, whether anyone intended that outcome or not. Understanding that doesn't make a shortage less frustrating, but it does make it less mysterious. And more broadly, it's worth noticing your own moral flexibility around gray area transactions, not to make you feel guilty about every cash tip or every discount deal, but because that flexibility is worth being aware of rather than operating on autopilot. Some of these gaps are genuinely low stakes and harmless. Others carry real risk, real victims, or real consequences you might not be pricing in just because the transaction felt informal rather than official. What stays with me most about this topic is how mechanical the whole thing turns out to be underneath all the moral framing we usually bring to it. A black market isn't really a story about bad actors exploiting a system. It's a story about a gap created somewhere upstream by a price, a rule, or a restriction, and demand simply finding the most efficient path around it, the same way water finds a crack in a dam, regardless of how well-intentioned the dam was. That doesn't mean every rule that creates a gap is wrong, and it doesn't mean every black market that fills that gap is harmless. Both things can be true and complicated at the same time. But there's something clarifying about seeing the mechanism plainly. Prices and rules aren't just abstract policy tools. They're forces that reshape where and how people actually get what they want, whether the official system accounted for that or not. You don't need to think about black markets constantly to benefit from understanding this. You just need to remember, the next time you notice a strange price gap, a suspiciously good deal, or a shortage that seems to have appeared out of nowhere, that there's almost always a gap somewhere upstream creating it. Seeing that gap clearly is usually the first step to understanding what's actually happening, rather than just what it looks like on the surface. Progress beats perfection. Even here, you don't have to solve the whole system. You just have to notice it.
If seeing the mechanics behind something like this is useful to you, not just the what, but the why underneath it, that's really what this whole channel is for. I'm Business Decoded, and if you want more of this kind of thinking, subscribing genuinely helps. Thanks for spending this time with me, and I'll see you in the next one.